Welcome to Tomb of the Topstones, an ongoing series exploring the world of Topstone masks. This episode will examine a very rare and mysterious mask, the horrible Melting Man. The mask was introduced in 1961 as part of a new collection of Keith Ward designs. Topstone had just emerged from reorganization and touted the masks as a sign that the company was strong and competitive. The Melting Man is probably the grisliest mask in Topstone's classic Keith Ward pantheon, and one of the earliest examples of what would later be known as a gore mask, a category that would come into its own during the 1980s thanks to companies like Distortions Unlimited. Masks depicting mutilated faces were all the rage throughout the 1980s, but in the 60s, these kinds of gruesome mask designs were uncommon and shocking. Speaking of shocking, it could be argued that the Topstone Shock Monster is the granddaddy of gore masks. But Shock is more of a monster, a boogeyman, than a mutilated human. In my mind, a true gore mask depicts a victim, not a monster. Judging by the look on his face, the horrible Melting Man is definitely a victim. He's not a member of the undead, he is a dying man. The origins of this mask are mysterious. It doesn't seem to be inspired by anything in popular culture. The famous Monsters mail order ad, which first appeared in issue 13, says the mask was inspired by the movie House of Wax. But that's probably just Jim Warren advertising ballyhoo. The mask obviously depicts a very alarmed, flesh and blood person melting, not a wax figure. Famous Monsters issue 29 has a cover that looks somewhat like the Melting Man. It is based on the 1964 film The Flesh Eaters, in which microbial organisms dissolve people's flesh. But the Melting Man mask predates the movie and the magazine cover by 3 years. The Blob, released in 1958, depicted people being slowly absorbed by the oozing monster. A similar creature appeared in 1959's Kaltiki, the Immortal Monster. The concept is similar to the Melting Man, but the mask character seems to be melting on his own without any external influence, a kind of spontaneous human disintegration. If the Melting Man seems like the odd man out in the Keith Ward lineup, could it be because Keith Ward did not sculpt it? There is a story in mask collecting circles that the Melting Man was actually sculpted by a California-based movie effects artist. According to the story, the artist was the winner of a mask design contest. His grand prize was seeing his Melting Man design produced by Topstone. Unfortunately, that artist has passed away. I have tried to corroborate the story by interviewing former Topstone employees. So far, I have found no independent testimony to verify the contest story. It seems likely that a Topstone mask design contest would have been promoted in Famous Monsters magazine, given what publisher James Warren says was a very strong professional relationship between he and Keith Ward. But there was no promotion, no announcements. Perhaps it was promoted in FM's rival, Castile of Frankenstein. But that magazine did not premiere until 1962, a year after Topstone introduced the Melting Man. I have found no evidence of a mask design contest being promoted in any publication. And finally, the mask itself bears Keith Ward's circular trademark stamp, a Keith Ward creation. Though he did base some masks on Hollywood movie monsters, I would need solid proof before I accepted that Keith Ward would put his name on an independent artist's design. All evidence points to Keith Ward being the creator of the Melting Man. Based on the information available at this time, I have to consider the mask contest story to be apocryphal. This enigmatic mask was immortalized in a masterpiece of fine art photography by one of the 20th century's most enigmatic photographers. Ralph Eugene Meatyard was a pioneering Kentucky-based photographer known for creating haunting black and white surrealist images. It would take an entire book to do justice to Meatyard's career, and indeed many books have been written about him. Though he worked with a variety of subject matter, his most iconic images are of people wearing masks. And most of those masks were made by Topstone. One of Meatyard's most famous photographs is titled Romance from Ambrose Bierce, No. 3, from 1962. It shows his family wearing rubber Halloween masks as they sit in bleachers, and one of the masks is the melting man. The photo is considered a classic. Anyone interested in masks or photography should look up Ralph Eugene Meatyard. He is a fascinating figure. Back to the melting man. Unlike many classic Topstone masks, the original factory master for the melting man seems to be lost to history. It was not part of the historic find of Topstone masters 18 years ago. If the master still exists, its whereabouts are unknown. That means there are no modern pulls of the mask that I can use to show its fine detail. However, we do have the next best thing. VXXFX created this original sculpture based on Keith Ward's Melting Man illustration. He has sculpted many modern masks based on classic horror comics illustrations, and his Melting Man is much in that vein. It captures the spirit of the 60s mail-order ads rather than trying to recreate the mask itself. Since there is only one known surviving example of the original Topstone mask, using a vintage Melting Man for reference might not have been practical. And here is that lone surviving vintage example of the Topstone horrible melting man. As far as the mask community knows, as of February 2018, this is the one and only existing vintage copy of this mask. It was foam-filled decades ago by people who realized its historic significance and sought to preserve it. You can see the psychedelic colors used on the melting half of the face. It reminds me of a failed attempt to fry eggs, resulting in a half-scrambled mess of white and yolk. Keith Ward's illustration makes the character look surprised and alarmed, but the expression on this vintage mask looks more like a man suffering, like it's capturing the moment before his death, a casualty of some 50s-style sci-fi disaster. The right ear was already rotting at the time the mask was foamed, and unfortunately has sustained further damage over the years. It has been restored back to the condition it was in at the time it was foamed. The mask is brittle as an eggshell. If it fell, it would crack all over. If not for the foam inside of it, it would have been destroyed long ago. But foam deteriorates, as anyone who drives an old car knows every time they turn on the air. This mask is going to need further conservation to keep it alive another 50 years. And that is going to be a very delicate operation if and when it is ever attempted. To my knowledge, Topstone never made a proper vacuform plastic version of the Melting Man, but they did make this amazing mask called Zombie in the 1970s catalogs. It's an unusual mask and vaguely familiar. That's because the sculpt is based on the Melting Man. You can see little details of the earlier rubber mask in this later plastic one, but obviously a lot of new details have been added to make both sides of the face disfigured. Based on catalogs, ads, and vintage photos, it seems the original Melting Man had been discontinued by the 1970s. I wonder if Topstone cannibalized the original master in order to make this plastic zombie mask, and if that is why the master for the Melting Man was not found with the others. When Topstone revamped the Keith Ward characters in the 1980s, they did not include the Melting Man. If the 80s versions were sculpted over the originals, which is likely the case, then the fact that they did not include the Melting Man could be further evidence that the master had already disappeared. Topstone did make another Melting Man mask in the 80s, but it was not based on the Keith Ward character. Instead, it was copied from a nearly identical mask produced by B Something Studios. By the 80s, Keith Ward was no longer involved with Topstone, and the company was doing things very differently than it had during its golden age. During the 1980s, Topstone released its own versions of many Be Something Studios masks. Topstone also produced licensed movie character masks in the 80s, including this fully authorized mask of Rick Baker's creation for the 1977 film, The Incredible Melting Man. This was part of a series of licensed movie masks, most of which had been previously released by Distortions Unlimited. But The Incredible Melting Man was unique to the Topstone series. It was an original sculpt that closely resembled the monster seen in the movie. Very often when collectors talk about the Topstone Melting Man, it's hard to know whether they mean the Keith Ward version or this movie version. Despite the mask's rarity today, the horrible Melting Man character is fondly remembered by monster fans who grew up in the 1960s. Keith Ward's design lives on in many fan-produced products, including model kits, pin-back buttons, enamel buttons, and artwork. And in the future, I'm sure we'll see many new interpretations of the character. That brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next installment of Tomb of the Topstones.